The cathedral bells tolled with a rhythm that matched the pounding of Felicity Ashford's heart as she stood before 200 witnesses in her ivory silk gown. The man she was meant to marry, Viscount Harold Pembroke, had just opened his mouth to speak. Not vows, but a declaration that would shatter her world. "I cannot marry a woman who brings nothing but a name to this union," he announced, his voice echoing through the sacred space. The gasps rippled through the pews like a wave. But before Felicity's knees could buckle, before the humiliation could fully consume her, a deep voice cut through the chaos from the back of the church. "Then it is fortunate, Pembroke, that I can. If you are listening to this story, don't forget to click the like button, subscribe to the channel, and tell me in the comments from which part of the world you are listening to this story. I want to know how far it has traveled." Felicity Ashford had been groomed for this moment since the day she turned 16. In the drawing rooms of Mayfair and the ballrooms of London's finest estates, her mother had paraded her like a prized mare at auction, whispering reminders that their family's fading fortune depended entirely upon an advantageous match. The Ashfords had once been a name of consequence, but her father's poor investments and penchant for gambling had reduced them to a facade of respectability held together by credit and desperation. When Viscount Harold Pembroke, heir to the Earl of Thornbridge, had shown interest in Felicity during the season of 1813, her mother had nearly wept with relief. The Pembrokes were old money, their wealth derived from vast estates in Yorkshire and shrewd investments in shipping ventures. Harold was considered a catch, handsome in a severe way, with dark hair swept back from a high forehead and cold blue eyes that rarely betrayed emotion. Their courtship had been brief and formal. Harold had called upon her exactly 3 times before proposing, and each visit had felt more like a business negotiation than a romantic encounter. He spoke of duty, of lineage, of the importance of maintaining standards. He never asked Felicity about her interests, her dreams, or her thoughts on anything beyond household management and social obligations. "You will make a suitable viscountess," he had told her when he proposed, as though he were commenting on the weather. There had been no bending of the knee, no passionate declaration, simply a statement of fact, followed by the presentation of a family ring, a heavy emerald that felt more like a shackle than an ornament. Felicity had accepted because she had no choice. Her mother's words echoed in her mind constantly. "We shall lose everything if you do not secure this match. Your younger sisters will have no prospects. We shall be ruined." The weight of her family's survival pressed upon her shoulders like a physical burden. The months leading to the wedding had been filled with preparations that felt increasingly suffocating. Harold's mother, the formidable Countess of Thornbridge, had taken control of every detail, dismissing Felicity's preferences with a wave of her jeweled hand. The wedding dress was chosen without Felicity's input, a creation of ivory silk and Belgian lace that was undeniably beautiful, but felt like a costume for a role she had not auditioned for. "You must understand, dear girl," the Countess had said during one particularly trying fitting, "that you are joining a family of considerable standing. We have expectations, standards. The Pembroke name has been unsullied for generations, and we intend to keep it that way." The implication was clear. Felicity was being granted a privilege, not entering a partnership. She was expected to be grateful, compliant, and invisible, except when required to perform her duties as a wife and eventually a mother. In the quiet moments alone in her bedchamber, Felicity had allowed herself to dream of a different life. She had always loved reading, particularly works of philosophy and natural history that her governess had discouraged as unsuitable for young ladies. She had once imagined marrying a man who would value her mind as well as her face, someone who would discuss ideas with her over breakfast and encourage her curiosity about the world. But such dreams were the luxury of women with dowries and options. Felicity had neither. The night before her wedding, she had sat at her window looking out over the London streets, watching the gas lamps flicker in the darkness. Her younger sister Arabella had crept into the room and sat beside her. "Are you frightened?" Arabella had asked, taking Felicity's hand. "Terrified," Felicity had admitted, the word escaping before she could stop it. "You do not have to do this," Arabella had whispered, though they both knew it was a lie. "I do," Felicity had replied. "For you, for Mama, for all of us." Now, as she stood in the entrance hall of their London townhouse on the morning of her wedding, Felicity barely recognized herself in the mirror. The woman looking back at her was pale, elegant, and utterly empty. Her golden hair had been arranged in an elaborate style beneath the veil, her green eyes enhanced with subtle cosmetics that could not quite hide the shadows beneath them. Her mother fussed with the train of her gown, her own eyes bright with unshed tears, though Felicity suspected they were tears of relief rather than sadness. Her father, looking uncomfortable in his formal attire, offered his arm to escort her to the waiting carriage. "You look beautiful, my dear," he said quietly, and for a moment she saw genuine regret in his eyes. "I am sorry it has come to this." Felicity said nothing. What could she say? That she wished he had been more careful with their fortune, that she wished her value extended beyond her potential as a bride, that she was about to promise her life to a man who saw her as little more than a decorative necessity. The journey to St. George's Church in Hanover Square passed in a blur. The streets were crowded with the usual London traffic: carriages, street vendors, ladies with parasols, gentlemen in top hats. Life continued around her with complete indifference to the fact that hers was ending. As they arrived at the church, Felicity could see the curious onlookers gathered outside, drawn by the spectacle of a society wedding. The Pembroke family had spared no expense, determined to showcase their status. The church was festooned with white roses and ribbons, and the pews were filled with London's elite, people who had come to witness the union and to judge every detail. Inside the vestibule, her father squeezed her hand. "It is time," he said. The organ began to play, the familiar notes of the wedding march filling the soaring space. The doors opened, and Felicity stepped forward on her father's arm, beginning the long walk down the aisle. Every eye turned to watch her progress. She kept her gaze fixed ahead, where Harold stood at the altar looking severe and formal in his wedding attire. Beside him stood his closest companion, Lord Edmund Fairfax, serving as his groomsman. And there, in the front pew, sat the Countess of Thornbridge, her expression one of cold satisfaction, a general surveying a successful campaign. As Felicity drew closer to the altar, her heart began to pound. Something felt wrong. Harold's expression was not that of a man about to wed. It was the expression of someone about to deliver unpleasant news. Lord Fairfax looked uncomfortable, his gaze darting away when she tried to meet his eyes. When she reached the altar and her father released her arm, Felicity turned to face Harold. For a moment, they simply looked at each other. She searched his face for some sign of warmth, some indication that he felt even a fraction of what this moment meant. But his eyes were as cold as ever, and his jaw was set with determination. The Archbishop began the ceremony, his voice sonorous and formal. The words washed over Felicity like water, familiar and inevitable. She heard herself making the responses automatically, her voice sounding distant to her own ears. Then came the moment when the Archbishop asked if anyone knew of any impediment to the marriage. The silence that followed should have been brief, a mere formality before proceeding. But it stretched, becoming uncomfortable. Felicity felt a prickle of unease travel down her spine. And then Harold cleared his throat and stepped back from her, his face hardening into an expression of contempt that shocked her with its suddenness. "I must speak," Harold announced, his voice carrying through the cathedral with devastating clarity. The Archbishop froze, his book still open in his hands. A collective intake of breath rippled through the assembled guests. Felicity felt the world tilt beneath her feet, confusion and dawning horror mixing in her chest. "Lord Pembroke?" the Archbishop said, his elderly face creasing with concern. "What is the meaning of this?" Harold turned to face the congregation, effectively presenting his back to Felicity. The insult was deliberate and cutting. When he spoke, His voice rang with theatrical righteousness that suggested he had rehearsed this moment. "I cannot in good conscience proceed with this union," he declared. "I have recently discovered information that makes this marriage impossible." Felicity's mother let out a small cry from her pew. The whispers began immediately, spreading through the church like wildfire. Felicity stood frozen, her mind struggling to process what was happening. This could not be real. This could not be happening. "Harold, what are you—" she began, but he cut her off with a raised hand, not even granting her the courtesy of looking at her. "The Ashford family," Harold continued, his voice dripping with disdain, "has been less than forthcoming about their financial situation. I was led to believe that Miss Ashford would bring a respectable dowry to this marriage. Instead, I have learned that the family is not merely in reduced circumstances. They are drowning in debt. There is no dowry. There are only creditors waiting to collect the moment this marriage provides them with access to Pembroke resources." Gasps of shock and murmurs of scandal filled the air. Felicity felt her face burning with humiliation. Her father rose from his pew, his face purple with rage and shame. "This is unconscionable," he shouted. "You agreed to the terms. We had an understanding." "An understanding based on deception," Harold shot back, finally turning to look at Felicity with such contempt that she physically recoiled. "I will not be trapped into a marriage with a woman who brings nothing but financial ruin. I will not allow the Pembroke name and fortune to be drained by a family too proud to admit their own failure." Tears stung Felicity's eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She would not give them all, the satisfaction of seeing her completely broken. But inside, she was crumbling. Every fear she had harbored about her worth, every anxiety about being nothing more than a burden and a commodity, was being confirmed before hundreds of witnesses. The Countess of Thornbridge stood, her face a mask of vindicated superiority. "My son has made the right decision," she announced. "The Pembrokes have maintained their position through careful stewardship and advantageous alliances. We cannot allow sentiment to override prudence." "But the bans have been posted," the Archbishop protested weakly. "The ceremony has begun. This is most irregular." "Better irregular than disastrous," Harold interrupted. He finally looked directly at Felicity, and what she saw in his eyes was not regret or even anger. It was disgust. "I am sorry, Miss Ashford, that you have been caught up in your family's schemes. But I cannot sacrifice my future and my family's security for the sake of misplaced chivalry." The church erupted into chaos. Some guests were standing, others craning their necks to get a better view of the spectacle. The whispers had become a roar of scandalized conversation. Felicity heard fragments. "The shame! How mortifying! Always suspected! Utter humiliation!" And then, cutting through Felicity's shock, came a voice she had not expected. From the pew directly behind the Pembrokes, a young woman stood, Harold's cousin, Charlotte Pembroke, whom Felicity had met only twice and had seemed pleasant enough during those brief encounters. "I must confess something as well," Charlotte announced, her voice trembling with what seemed like distress, but which Felicity suddenly recognized as poorly concealed triumph. "Lord Pembroke and we have formed an understanding. A true understanding based on genuine affection and shared values." The church went utterly silent. Felicity felt as though she had been slapped. She looked at Harold, and for the first time she saw a flicker of something other than coldness in his expression, a softness that appeared when he glanced at Charlotte. "You planned this," Felicity whispered, the realization crashing over her. "This entire humiliation. You wanted me here, in front of everyone, so that the world would understand that I am the injured party," Harold finished coldly. "Your family attempted to deceive me. I'm merely protecting myself and choosing a bride who brings something more than debt to our union." Charlotte had the grace to look slightly uncomfortable, but she moved to stand beside Harold nonetheless, taking his hand. The gesture was a final, devastating blow. Not only had Felicity been rejected, but she had been replaced, and the replacement had been waiting in the wings all along. Felicity's father was shouting, demanding satisfaction, speaking of honor and agreements. But his words sounded hollow even to Felicity's ears. Harold was right about one thing. They had deceived him about the extent of their financial troubles. They had been desperate enough to believe that once the marriage was complete, he would accept the situation rather than face the scandal of an annulment. They had miscalculated catastrophically. Felicity looked down at her hands, at the emerald engagement ring that suddenly felt like a brand of shame. With shaking fingers, she pulled it off and held it out toward Harold. He took it without a word, pocketing it as though it were nothing more than a recovered investment. The Archbishop looked utterly lost, clearly having never encountered such a situation in his decades of service. Guests were beginning to stand, some leaving, others staying to witness every moment of the disaster. Felicity could feel their eyes on her, pitying, shocked, judgmental, entertained. Her mother was weeping openly now, and her sisters looked horrified. The few friends Felicity had made among the ton were staring at her with expressions ranging from sympathy to the kind of fascination one might direct at a carriage accident. Felicity's mind raced through her options. She could flee the church, running from this nightmare. She could collapse, giving in to the shock and horror. She could rage at Harold, at Charlotte, at the injustice of it all. Instead, she stood perfectly still, drawing upon reserves of dignity she had not known she possessed. She would not run. She would not collapse. She would not give them the satisfaction. "You are quite right, Lord Pembroke," she said, her voice surprisingly steady, despite the tears she could no longer prevent from slipping down her cheeks. "We are not suited. I deserve a husband who possesses something you clearly lack: honor, compassion, and the courage to address concerns privately rather than staging a public execution for his own aggrandizement." Harold's face flushed with anger at her words, but before he could respond, a voice rang out from the back of the church. It was deep, commanding, and carried an authority that immediately silenced the chaos. "Then it is fortunate, Pembroke, that I can." Every head turned toward the source of the voice. Felicity, her vision blurred with tears, could make out only a tall figure striding down the aisle with purpose. The crowd parted before him like the Red Sea, and as he drew closer, Felicity recognized him with a jolt of shock. Damien Blackwood, Duke of Ashcroft. The Duke of Ashcroft was a figure of legend in London society, wealthy beyond measure, powerful in both political and social spheres, and notoriously selective about the company he kept. He was perhaps 30 years old, tall and imposing, with dark hair and striking grey eyes that seemed to see through pretense and artifice. He had inherited his title young after his father's death, and had spent the years since building the Ashcroft holdings into one of the most formidable fortunes in England. He was also known for keeping his distance from the marriage market, avoiding the machinations of ambitious mothers and their daughters with almost ruthless efficiency. His presence at the Pembroke-Ashford wedding had been noted with surprise when the guest list was announced. He and the Earl of Thornbridge had some business connections, but they were hardly intimates. Now, as Damien Blackwood walked down the aisle with measured, deliberate steps, every eye was fixed upon him. He reached the altar and looked first at Harold with an expression of withering contempt, then at Felicity with something that might have been concern. "Your Grace," the Archbishop stammered, "this is that is to say, what is the meaning?" "The meaning," Damien said calmly, his gaze never leaving Felicity's face, "is that Lord Pembroke has made his position clear. He finds Miss Ashford unsuitable due to financial considerations. I, however, have no such concerns. I am prepared to offer for Miss Ashford myself, here and now, if she will have me." The silence that followed was absolute. It was as though the entire church had stopped breathing. Felicity stared at the Duke in complete bewilderment. She had met him only once before, briefly at a ball 2 years prior. They had exchanged perhaps 10 words. Why would he— "You cannot be serious," Harold sputtered, his composure finally cracking. "Your Grace, this is absurd. You do not even know the girl." "I know enough," Damien replied coolly. "I know that she has been treated with appalling disrespect by a man too cowardly to address his concerns like a gentleman. I know that she stands here with remarkable grace under circumstances that would shatter most people. And I know that her family's financial situation is of no consequence to me whatsoever. He turned his full attention to Felicity. Miss Ashford, I'm aware this is highly irregular. You have no obligation to accept. But if you wish to salvage something from this disaster and escape with your dignity intact, I offer you my hand and my name. Felicity's mind reeled. This could not be happening. First rejected, now rescued by a duke she barely knew. It felt like a fever dream, unreal and impossible. But why? She whispered, the only question she could form through her shock. Something flickered in Damien's eyes. Was it amusement, respect? Because, Miss Ashford, I have spent the last hour watching Pembroke position himself for this little performance, and I find I have no tolerance for bullies who cloak cruelty in righteousness. And because I suspect you deserve far better than what you were about to settle for. He extended his hand to her. Felicity looked at it, then at Harold's outraged face, then at Charlotte's stunned expression. She thought of her family, of the ruin they faced, of the humiliation that would follow them forever if she simply walked away from this church unmarried and dishonored. And she thought of the Duke's words, "Escape with your dignity intact." With a decision that felt both reckless and inevitable, Felicity placed her hand in his. "Yes," she said, her voice growing stronger. "Yes, Your Grace. I accept." The church erupted once again, but this time the chaos had a different flavor. Shock, yes, but also excitement, speculation, and for some, approval. The Duke of Ashcroft was offering to marry the jilted bride. It was the stuff of fairy tales and scandalous novels. The Archbishop looked between Damien and Felicity with an expression of complete befuddlement. "Your Grace, this is unprecedented. The bans have not been published for you and Miss Ashford. I cannot simply... I have a special license," Damien interrupted smoothly, producing a folded document from his coat. "Procured this morning, all perfectly legal and proper." Harold's face had gone from red to purple. "This is outrageous. You planned this." "I anticipated that you might prove yourself to be exactly the sort of man your reputation suggested," Damien replied with icy disdain, "and I prepared accordingly. Now, if you would be so kind as to remove yourself from the altar, the Archbishop has a wedding to perform." For a moment, it seemed Harold might actually strike the Duke. But Damien merely raised an eyebrow, his posture relaxed, but somehow radiating the kind of power that came from absolute confidence in one's position. Harold, whatever his faults, was not foolish enough to physically assault a duke. With a sound of pure fury, Harold grabbed Charlotte's hand and stalked out of the church, pushing through the crowd without regard for courtesy. The Countess of Thornbridge followed, her expression one of absolute shock and outrage. Several other guests departed with them, but Felicity noted that many more remained, settling back into their pews with the air of people who had just been promised the entertainment of the decade. The Archbishop examined the special license, his hands trembling slightly. "This appears to be in order," he said finally. "But Your Grace, Miss Ashford, are you both certain? This is a marriage we are discussing, not a rescue mission." Damien looked at Felicity, and she saw something in his eyes, a question, giving her one final chance to refuse. "Miss Ashford?" Felicity took a deep breath. She did not know this man. She did not know his motives or his character beyond his reputation. But she knew with absolute certainty that she could not walk out of this church unmarried, could not return to her family's house to face the ruin and humiliation that would follow. The Duke was offering her an escape, and whatever his reasons, she would be a fool not to take it. "I am certain," she said. And so, in a turn of events that would be discussed in London drawing rooms for years to come, the Archbishop began the wedding ceremony again. This time, when he asked if anyone knew of any impediment, the silence was absolute. This time, when the vows were exchanged, Felicity's voice did not waver. And this time, when the Archbishop pronounced them man and wife, the ring that Damien slipped onto her finger was his own signet ring, hastily adjusted, but given with a gentleness that surprised her. "You may kiss the bride," the Archbishop said, sounding somewhat dazed by the entire affair. Damien leaned forward and pressed a chaste, brief kiss to Felicity's lips. It was nothing more than a formality, but Felicity felt the reality of what she had just done crash over her. She was married to a duke, a man she did not know. As they turned to face the congregation, now as the Duke and Duchess of Ashcroft, the applause was thunderous. Some of it was genuine. Many in attendance had found Harold Pembroke insufferable and were delighted to see him thwarted. Some was merely the polite response to a ducal wedding, and some was the enthusiasm of those who recognized they had just witnessed one of the most scandalous and romantic events the Tun had seen in years. Damien offered Felicity his arm, and together they walked back down the aisle. With each step, Felicity felt the weight of what had happened settling more firmly upon her shoulders. She had escaped one cage, but what sort of cage had she entered now? Outside the church, Damien's carriage waited, a magnificent vehicle bearing the Ashcroft coat of arms, drawn by 4 matched greys. He handed her into it with practiced courtesy, then joined her inside. As the carriage pulled away from the church, leaving the chaos and scandal behind, they sat in silence for several long moments. Finally, Felicity found her voice. "Your Grace, I do not understand why you did that. You barely know me. You have bound yourself to a woman with no fortune, a scandal attached to her name, and a family in ruins. What could you possibly gain from this marriage?" Damien regarded her thoughtfully. "What do I gain? The satisfaction of putting an arrogant fool in his place, the pleasure of rescuing someone who did not deserve the treatment she was receiving, and," he paused, "perhaps the hope that an unconventional marriage might prove more genuine than the typical society match." But you do not know me," Felicity repeated. "I could be terrible, I could be anything." "True," Damien acknowledged, "but I am an excellent judge of character, Miss Ash. That is, Your Grace. Forgive me, I suspect we shall both need time to adjust to that. I saw how you carried yourself in that church. I saw your dignity, your courage, and your intelligence. Those qualities are worth far more than any dowry." Felicity felt tears threatening again, but these were different from the tears of humiliation she had shed at the altar. These were tears of relief, exhaustion, and overwhelming confusion. "I do not know what to say," she admitted. "Then say nothing," Damien replied gently. "We have time. For now, let us simply survive the day. I am taking you to Ashcroft House, my London residence. You will have your own apartments, your own staff, and complete privacy to process what has occurred. We can discuss the practical arrangements of our marriage when you are recovered from this ordeal." The carriage ride through London passed in a blur. Felicity was aware of the streets, the buildings, the people, but it all seemed distant and unreal. She kept expecting to wake up, to discover this was some strange dream. But the weight of the unfamiliar ring on her finger and the solid presence of the Duke beside her confirmed the reality of her situation. Ashcroft House, when they arrived, was magnificent. A grand townhouse in Grosvenor Square that spoke of wealth, taste, and power. Servants lined up to greet their new Duchess, and Felicity found herself swept into a world of luxury she had glimpsed but never truly inhabited. A housekeeper, Mrs. Winters, showed Felicity to her apartments, a suite of rooms decorated in soft blues and golds, elegant and welcoming. "His Grace thought you might wish to rest," Mrs. Winters said kindly. "I've had a bath drawn, and a light meal will be brought up shortly. If you need anything at all, you have only to ring." Alone at last, Felicity sank onto the edge of the enormous bed and let the tears come. She cried for the humiliation she had endured, for the life she had thought she would have, for the terror and uncertainty of her current situation. She cried until she was empty, exhausted, and strangely numb. When the tears finally stopped, she rose and caught sight of herself in the mirror. She was still wearing her wedding gown, the gown she had worn to marry Harold, now worn to marry someone else entirely. It suddenly felt wrong, tainted. With fumbling fingers, she began to unfasten the dozens of tiny buttons, struggling until a soft knock at the door announced the arrival of a lady's maid. "Your Grace, I am Margaret. His Grace assigned me to attend you. May I help?" Too tired to protest, Felicity allowed Margaret to help her out of the elaborate gown and into the prepared bath. The hot water soothed her aching body, and Margaret's gentle, unobtrusive presence was oddly comforting. Later, dressed in a borrowed nightgown and robe, Felicity sat by the window of her new bedroom and looked out over London. Somewhere in this city, Harold and Charlotte were likely celebrating their successful scheme. Somewhere, her family was dealing with the scandal and confusion of what had occurred. And here, in Ashcroft House, she was a duchess, married to a stranger who had saved her for reasons she still did not fully understand. What had she done? What kind of life awaited her now? The days following the wedding passed in a strange blur of adjustment and revelation. Damien proved to be as good as his word. He gave Felicity space, privacy, and time to recover from the trauma of her humiliation. They shared meals occasionally, conversations that were polite and gradually grew easier as they learned the basics about each other. Felicity discovered that the Duke was nothing like Harold. Where her former fiancé had been cold and dismissive, Damien was thoughtful and genuinely interested in her opinions. When she mentioned her love of reading during one dinner, he immediately arranged for her to have full access to his extensive library. When she expressed anxiety about her new role as Duchess, he provided her with a capable secretary and assured her that she could approach her duties at her own pace. "This is not a typical marriage," he told her one evening as they sat in the drawing room after dinner. "We both know that. You did not choose this, and I imposed it upon you in a moment of crisis. But that does not mean we cannot make something worthwhile of it. I have no expectations beyond basic courtesy and mutual respect. The rest, if it comes, will come naturally." "You are very kind," Felicity said, the words inadequate for what she felt. "I still do not fully understand why you helped me, but I am grateful." Damien set down his glass of port and regarded her seriously. "I told you that I dislike bullies. That is true. But there is more. My own mother was trapped in a marriage to a cruel man, my father, because she had no other options. I watched her suffer for years, her spirit slowly crushed by a man who saw her as property rather than a person. When she died, it was almost a relief for her, though it shattered me. I swore then that if I ever had the power to prevent another woman from suffering such a fate, I would use it." Felicity felt her heart contract with sympathy. "I am so sorry. That must have been terrible. It taught me that marriages based solely on financial or social considerations, without regard for basic human compatibility and respect, are often prisons," Damien continued. "When I saw what Pembroke was doing to you, the calculated cruelty of it, I could not stand by. And yes, there was also an element of strategic satisfaction in thwarting him. He has been attempting to block some of my business ventures for months, and this rather effectively demonstrated that he has misjudged both his importance and his adversary. So there had been some personal motivation beyond pure altruism." Felicity found this oddly comforting. It made Damien seem more human, less like an impossibly noble figure from a novel. As the week progressed, Felicity ventured out of the house for the first time since the wedding. She visited her family, a visit that was both necessary and painful. Her mother wept and thanked her profusely for saving them from ruin. The Duke had quietly paid off their most pressing debts as a wedding gift. Her father looked at her with a mixture of relief and guilt. Her sisters embraced her, full of questions about her new life. "Are you happy?" Arabella asked privately. "Or have you simply traded one prison for another?" "I do not know yet," Felicity answered honestly. "But if it is a prison, at least the jailer is kind." Through her family, Felicity learned of the aftermath of the scandal. Harold and Charlotte had left London for his estate in Yorkshire, fleeing the mockery and disapproval that had followed their actions. The Ton, always hungry for entertainment, had largely sided with Felicity, or rather, with the Duke. A powerful Duke rescuing a wronged bride from a lesser nobleman's cruelty made for a much better story than a practical Viscount protecting his interests. The Countess of Thornbridge had attempted to spin the narrative in her son's favour, but even her influence could not overcome the facts. Harold had humiliated his bride publicly, and the Duke of Ashcroft had stepped in to save her. It was the stuff of romantic legends, and society adored it. But Felicity knew that admiration from afar was different from acceptance. She was still a duchess who had been jilted at the altar before her unconventional marriage. She would need to prove herself worthy of her new position, and that would require facing society directly. Damien agreed when she raised the subject. The season is not yet over. There is a ball next week hosted by the Duchess of Devonshire. It will be well attended, and it will be an excellent opportunity for you to make your debut as the Duchess of Ashcroft. The thought terrified Felicity, but she also recognized the necessity. Will you be there? Every moment, Damien promised. I will not leave your side unless you wish me to. The week leading up to the ball, Felicity prepared with the help of Damien's aunt, Lady Agatha Blackwood, who arrived at Ashcroft House like a force of nature. She was in her 60s, sharp-eyed, witty, and utterly unintimidated by society's opinions. "You poor dear," she said when she met Felicity, embracing her with surprising warmth. "What a dreadful ordeal. But you have landed on your feet, and now we must ensure that everyone knows it. You are not the jilted Miss Ashford anymore. You are the Duchess of Ashcroft, and that means something." Lady Agatha took charge of Felicity's preparations with efficiency and enthusiasm. She helped select a gown for the ball, a stunning creation of deep sapphire silk that brought out the color of Felicity's eyes and made her look regal and sophisticated. She coached Felicity on how to carry herself, how to deflect impertinent questions, and how to use her new position to her advantage. "You have power now, my dear," Lady Agatha told her. "Perhaps you did not seek it, but you have it nonetheless. As the wife of one of the most influential men in England, your approval or disapproval matters. Use that wisely, and you will navigate society with ease." The night of the Devonshire ball arrived, and Felicity found herself in the carriage with Damien, her heart pounding with anxiety. She looked beautiful. She could see that in the mirror and in Damien's expression when he had first seen her in the gown. But beauty would not protect her from cutting remarks or barely concealed mockery. "You will be magnificent," Damien said, as though reading her thoughts, "and anyone foolish enough to offer insult will answer to me." "I do not need you to fight my battles," Felicity replied, surprising herself with the firmness in her voice. Damien smiled. "No, I suspect you do not, but it is comforting to know one has reinforcements if needed." The Devonshire House ballroom was packed with London's elite, a glittering sea of silks, jewels, and barely concealed curiosity. When the Duke and Duchess of Ashcroft were announced, a hush fell over the room, followed immediately by a surge of whispers. Felicity felt every eye upon her as she descended the stairs on Damien's arm. She kept her head high, her expression serene, channeling every lesson Lady Agatha had taught her. She was not the humiliated bride. She was the Duchess of Ashcroft. She belonged here. The Duchess of Devonshire, their hostess, greeted them warmly. "Your Grace, welcome, and Your Grace," she said to Felicity with genuine kindness. "How delightful to see you. You look absolutely radiant. Marriage clearly agrees with you." "Thank you, Your Grace," Felicity replied with a smile. "You are very kind." As they moved through the ballroom, people approached to offer congratulations and make conversation. Some were genuinely friendly, others clearly curious about the scandalous wedding. Felicity handled each interaction with grace, neither overly effusive nor coldly distant. And then across the room, she saw Harold and Charlotte. They had returned to London, apparently deciding that fleeing had been a mistake. Harold looked tense and uncomfortable, while Charlotte's expression was one of poorly concealed jealousy as she took in Felicity's gown, her jewels, and her position at the Duke's side. Damien noticed them as well. "Would you like to leave?" he asked quietly. "No," Felicity said, surprising herself. "I will not run from them, not any more." It was Harold who approached first, his pride apparently overcoming his sense of self-preservation. Charlotte followed reluctantly. "Your Grace," Harold said stiffly, bowing to Damien. Then, with visible reluctance, "Your Grace," to Felicity. "Lord Pembroke," Damien replied with cool civility. "Miss, I beg your pardon, you are not yet married, are you?" The barb landed. Charlotte flushed, and Harold's jaw tightened. "We are engaged," Charlotte said quickly. "How lovely," Felicity replied with perfect politeness. "I wish you both every happiness." The words were gracious, but there was a strength in her voice that had not been there in the church. She was not the same frightened girl who had stood at that altar. She had survived humiliation, had been given a second chance, and she would not waste it by cowering before those who had wronged her. Harold seemed to recognize this change. His expression flickered with something that might have been regret or simply frustration at having lost a tactical advantage. "I suppose I should thank you, Lord Pembroke," Felicity continued, her tone conversational. "If you had not shown your true character so clearly, I might never have discovered that I deserved better. In saving yourself from a marriage you deemed unsuitable, you inadvertently saved me from a far worse fate, a lifetime bound to a man incapable of honor or compassion." Harold's face went red. "You presume much, madam." "She presumes nothing," Damien interjected, his voice carrying a warning edge. "She states a fact. Now, if you will excuse us, I believe my wife has many other guests eager to make her acquaintance." They moved away, leaving Harold and Charlotte standing in frustrated silence. As they crossed the ballroom, Felicity realized she was trembling, not with fear, but with exhilaration. She had faced them, had spoken her truth, and had emerged victorious. "That was well done," Damien murmured. "You have a spine of steel, Your Grace." "I am learning to find it," Felicity replied. The rest of the evening passed in a whirl of conversation, dancing, and genuine enjoyment. Felicity found herself relaxing, discovering that many people were truly welcoming. She danced with Damien, and though they were still learning each other's rhythms, there was an ease between them that had not been there before. As the night drew to a close and they returned to Ashcroft House, Damien walked Felicity to her apartments. "You were brilliant tonight," he said. "I am proud to call you my Duchess." "Thank you," Felicity replied, "for everything, for rescuing me, for being patient, for seeing something in me worth saving." Damien smiled, and it was a smile of genuine warmth. "I did not save you, Felicity. I merely provided an opportunity. You saved yourself." As she prepared for bed that night, Felicity reflected on how much had changed in just 2 weeks. She had gone from a terrified bride in a loveless arrangement to a confident duchess, discovering her own strength. The marriage was still new, still strange, but it was beginning to feel like it might become something real. And as she drifted off to sleep, she found herself thinking not of what she had lost, but of what she might still gain. The weeks following the Devonshire ball brought a shift in Felicity's relationship with Damien. What had begun as a marriage of rescue was slowly transforming into a genuine partnership. They spent more time together, not out of obligation, but out of mutual enjoyment. Damien sought out Felicity's opinions on matters of estate management and even some of his business ventures, and he discovered that she had a sharp mind for details and strategy. "You have a gift for this," he told her one afternoon as they reviewed proposals for improving tenant conditions on one of his estates. "You see connections and implications that others miss." Felicity felt a glow of pride. For so long, her intelligence had been dismissed as irrelevant or worse, as something to hide lest it make her unmarriageable. To have it recognized and valued was intoxicating. Lady Agatha became a regular visitor and an invaluable mentor. She introduced Felicity to a circle of intellectual women, blue-stockings, reformers, and independent thinkers who gathered regularly to discuss philosophy, politics, and literature. For the first time in her life, Felicity found herself in an environment where her thoughts and ideas were not just tolerated, but encouraged and debated. "This is what I always dreamed of," she confessed to Damien one evening. "To be able to think and discuss ideas without being told it was inappropriate for a lady." "Then you should have it always," Damien replied. "I have no patience for the notion that women should be decorative and silent. Intelligence is to be celebrated, regardless of the gender of its possessor." Their conversations grew longer and deeper, ranging from the practical to the philosophical. Felicity learned about Damien's work to reform labor conditions in his factories, his support for gradual political reform, and his genuine concern for the welfare of those dependent on his estates. She shared her own thoughts on education for women, on the injustices she had observed in society's treatment of those without wealth or position. They were, Felicity realized, becoming friends. But beneath the friendship, something else was growing. She found herself noticing things about Damien that had nothing to do with his position or his kindness. The way he looked when he was focused on reading, his brow slightly furrowed in concentration. The unexpected humor that emerged when he was relaxed. The gentleness of his hands when he helped her from a carriage. The way his eyes softened when he looked at her. And she began to suspect, from the way he sometimes looked at her, a gaze that lingered just a moment too long, a smile that seemed to hold unspoken feelings, that he might be experiencing something similar. The London season drew to a close, and Damien suggested they remove to Ashcroft Abbey, his country estate in Derbyshire. "It is beautiful there," he said, "peaceful, and I think we could both benefit from some time away from the scrutiny of society." Felicity agreed eagerly. The idea of seeing Damien's true home, the place he had grown up, felt like an important step in truly understanding her husband. The journey to Derbyshire took 2 days, and they travelled together in Damien's well-appointed carriage, playing cards, reading and talking. By the time they arrived at Ashcroft Abbey, Felicity felt closer to Damien than she had to anyone in her life. The Abbey was magnificent, a sprawling estate with grounds that stretched as far as the eye could see, formal gardens giving way to parkland, forests, and a lake that sparkled in the afternoon sun. The house itself was ancient, parts dating back centuries, but it had been lovingly maintained and updated. "Welcome home," Damien said softly as they stood on the front steps. Home. The word resonated in Felicity's heart. Could this truly become her home? Could this marriage, born of scandal and rescue, become something real and lasting? Over the following weeks, Felicity explored the estate, met the tenants, and began to understand the scope of Damien's responsibilities. She also began to take on responsibilities of her own, working with the housekeeper to improve conditions for the staff and visiting the village to assess the needs of the community. One afternoon, while walking through the gardens, Felicity encountered an elderly woman tending to the roses. They struck up a conversation, and Felicity learned that this was Mrs. Henley, who had been head gardener at the Abbey for 40 years. "I remember His Grace's mother," Mrs. Henley said with a sad smile. "Such a gentle soul. She loved these gardens. She would come here when things were difficult in the house, when His Grace's father was... well, it was a difficult time." "And Damien told me about his parents," Felicity said quietly. "It must have been hard for everyone." "It was," Mrs. Henley confirmed. "The late Duke was a harsh man, but young Damien, he vowed he would never be like his father, and he has kept that vow. He is the best master we could hope for, fair, kind, and genuinely concerned for our welfare." This conversation, and others like it, helped Felicity understand Damien more deeply. His rescue of her had not been a whim or a power play. It was an extension of his fundamental character, shaped by his own painful history. One evening, as they walked together by the lake, Felicity decided to speak openly about what was in her heart. "Damien," she began, then hesitated. He stopped walking and turned to her, his expression attentive. "Yes? I want to thank you again for what you did, for saving me from Harold. But more than that, I want to thank you for the life you have given me since then, for the freedom to think, to learn, to be myself. I never expected to find such things in a marriage, nor did I expect to find such a remarkable partner, Damien replied. Felicity, I must confess something. When I offered to marry you in that church, it was indeed to save you from humiliation and to thwart Pembroke. But in the weeks since, this marriage has become more than I anticipated. I find myself grateful every day that circumstances brought you into my life. Felicity's heart raced. What are you saying? Damien took her hands in his grey eyes intense and sincere. I am saying that I have come to care for you deeply. This began as a marriage of convenience, but it has become something far more significant. I am falling in love with you, Felicity. Perhaps I already have fallen. The words hung in the air between them, profound and transformative. Felicity felt tears prick her eyes, but these were tears of joy. I have been afraid to hope, she admitted, afraid that what I was feeling was one-sided or foolish. But I love you too, Damien, not because you rescued me, but because of who you are. Your kindness, your intelligence, your compassion. You have given me everything I never dared to dream of. Damien smiled, a smile of pure happiness, and pulled her into his arms. When he kissed her this time, it was nothing like the chaste kiss at their wedding. It was passionate, tender, and full of promise. When they finally broke apart, both breathless, Damien laughed, a sound of pure joy. We should perhaps have a proper wedding night, he suggested, his eyes twinkling with humor and desire. Felicity blushed but smiled. I think that would be appropriate, Your Grace. That night, their marriage was consummated, and it was nothing like the clinical duty Felicity had been taught to expect. It was beautiful, intimate, and deeply loving. A true union of two people who had found each other against all odds. In the days that followed, their relationship deepened further. They were no longer just husband and wife by necessity, but partners and lovers by choice. News came from London occasionally. Harold and Charlotte had married quietly, a small ceremony that drew little attention. Reports suggested the marriage was not a happy one. Charlotte had discovered that Harold's fortune was not as extensive as she had believed, and Harold found her far less agreeable as a wife than as a co-conspirator. I suppose they are discovering that marriages based on scheming and selfishness rarely prosper, Lady Agatha wrote in one of her letters. While you and Damien are proof that sometimes the most unconventional unions become the strongest. Felicity agreed wholeheartedly. What had begun in scandal and desperation had transformed into genuine love. She had found not just security, but happiness, purpose, and a partnership she had never believed possible. As autumn approached, and they prepared to return to London for the winter season, Felicity reflected on the journey that had brought her to this point. She had been publicly humiliated, had her worth questioned and denied, but from that catastrophe had emerged something wonderful, a life she could never have imagined, with a man who saw and valued her true self. Are you ready to face society again? Damien asked, as they prepared for the journey. With you beside me, Felicity replied. I am ready for anything. 18 months after that fateful day in St. George's Church, Felicity stood in the drawing room of Ashcroft House, looking out over Grosvenor Square with a sense of contentment she had once thought impossible. The winter season was in full swing, and she was preparing to host her first major social event as Duchess of Ashcroft, a salon bringing together some of the most brilliant minds in London to discuss education reform. It was exactly the kind of event she had always dreamed of hosting, but had never dared to suggest during her engagement to Harold. Damien had encouraged her enthusiastically, offering both financial support and the use of his considerable influence to attract speakers and attendees. You are going to change the world, one salon at a time, he had told her with pride. The event was a tremendous success. Reformers, educators and progressive members of Parliament gathered in the Ashcroft drawing room, debating the merits of expanded education for the poor and, daringly, for women. Felicity found herself at the center of it all. facilitating conversations, contributing her own ideas, and earning respect from people she admired. Lady Agatha attended, of course, beaming with pride at her protégée. "You have found your calling," she told Felicity during a quiet moment. "You are not just a duchess, you are becoming a force for genuine change." After the guests departed, Damien found Felicity in the library, reviewing notes from the evening's discussions. He wrapped his arms around her from behind, pressing a kiss to her temple. "You were magnificent tonight," he murmured. "I was terrified," Felicity admitted with a laugh, "but also exhilarated. Damien, I think we might actually be able to accomplish something meaningful." Lord Melbourne seemed genuinely interested in supporting legislation for expanded girls' schools. "Then we shall make it happen," Damien promised. "Together." Together. It was a word that had come to define their marriage. They were partners in every sense. In managing the estates, in social endeavors, in their growing involvement in reform movements, and in the deep love that had continued to deepen with each passing day. In private moments, Felicity sometimes reflected on what her life would have been like if Harold had not rejected her at the altar. She would be Viscountess Pembroke, living in Yorkshire under the thumb of her controlling husband and domineering mother-in-law, her intelligence and spirit slowly suffocated by expectations and restrictions. Instead, she was the Duchess of Ashcroft, hosting intellectual salons, working to improve conditions for workers and tenants, and planning educational initiatives. She was respected, valued, and deeply loved. Reports of Harold and Charlotte reached them occasionally through the gossip networks that permeated society. The marriage had indeed proven disastrous. Charlotte had expected wealth and status, but had discovered that Harold's estates were heavily mortgaged, and his income far more modest than she had believed. Harold, in turn, had found Charlotte to be demanding, petty, and utterly lacking in the domestic skills or intellectual companionship that might have made their union tolerable. They lived largely separated now, Harold in Yorkshire and Charlotte in a modest London townhouse, each nursing their disappointment and regret. The Tun, which had briefly sided with them after the wedding scandal, had long since moved on to other amusements, leaving the Pembrokes to their unhappy fate. Felicity felt no satisfaction in their misery, only a profound gratitude that she had escaped that destiny. One spring morning, Felicity made an announcement that filled Damien with joy. She was with child. The news spread through their circle of friends and family with celebrations and congratulations. Lady Agatha wept with happiness, and Felicity's mother and sisters visited with gifts and excitement. "You will be a wonderful mother," Arabella told her sister, "and your child will have everything you never had. Parents who love each other and value intelligence and kindness over social position." As Felicity's pregnancy progressed, she and Damien spent much of their time at Ashcroft Abbey, enjoying the peace and beauty of the countryside. They walked the gardens together, discussed plans for the nursery, and talked about the values they hoped to instill in their children. "I want them to know that their worth is not determined by their birth or their fortune," Felicity said one evening as they sat by the fire in the library. "I want them to understand that true honor comes from how we treat others, especially those with less power than ourselves." "They will know it," Damien assured her, "because they will see it every day in how we live our lives." When their daughter was born in the autumn, a healthy, beautiful child with her mother's golden hair and her father's grey eyes, they named her Isabel Sophia, after Damien's mother and Felicity's favourite philosopher. She was christened at the local church in a simple ceremony, attended by family and close friends, a far cry from the grand spectacle that had been planned for Felicity's ill-fated wedding to Harold. "She is perfect," Damien said, cradling his daughter with a tenderness that made Felicity's heart overflow with love. "She is ours," Felicity replied, "born of love, not obligation. Everything we never had, she will have." The years that followed were filled with purpose and joy. Felicity's salons became famous throughout London, attracting reformers, writers and thinkers from across the country. With Damien's support, she established a school for girls in the village near Ashcroft Abbey, providing education for those who would otherwise have none. Damien's own work in Parliament and his management of his estates earned him a reputation as one of the most progressive and effective peers in England. Together, they became known as a couple who used their position and resources to make genuine differences in people's lives. They had 2 more children, a son, Thomas, and another daughter, Eleanor. The Ashcroft nursery was filled with laughter, learning, and love. The children grew up surrounded by books, encouraged to ask questions, and taught to value character over status. On the 5th anniversary of their unconventional wedding, Damien arranged a private celebration at Ashcroft Abbey. As they danced together in the ballroom where his parents had once held grand parties, Felicity reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought them to this moment. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked. "The scandal, the gossip, the unconventional nature of how we began?" Damien pulled her closer, his eyes full of love and certainty. "Not for a single moment. That day in St. George's Church, when I stepped forward to claim you, was the best decision I ever made. You have brought joy, purpose, and love into my life beyond anything I imagined possible. And you saved me," Felicity said softly, "not just from humiliation, but from a life where I would never have been truly myself. You gave me freedom, love, and the chance to make a difference in the world." "We saved each other," Damien corrected gently, "and we continue to save each other every day." It was true. Their marriage was not perfect, no marriage is, but it was real, built on mutual respect, genuine affection, and shared values. What had begun as a desperate rescue had become a true partnership, and what had started as a scandalous marriage of convenience had blossomed into one of the great love stories of their generation. As they stood together on the terrace of Ashcroft Abbey, watching the sun set over the grounds they loved, their children playing in the gardens below, and the future stretching out before them full of promise, Felicity understood a fundamental truth. Sometimes the worst moments of our lives lead us to the best. Her public humiliation had felt like the end of everything, but it had actually been the beginning of something far more wonderful than she had ever dared to dream. She had not chosen this path initially. It had been thrust upon her by scandal and necessity, but she had made it her own through courage, intelligence, and the willingness to embrace an uncertain future. And in doing so, she had discovered that true happiness comes not from following the prescribed path, but from having the bravery to forge a new one. The Duke had stepped from the crowd to claim her, but in the end she had claimed herself, her own voice, her own purpose, her own destiny. And that, Felicity reflected as Damien's arm wrapped around her waist and his lips pressed a kiss to her temple, was the greatest triumph of all. If you enjoyed this story, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment telling me where in the world you're listening from. I love hearing how far these stories travel. Thank you for being part of this journey.